Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. We will be starting shortly, so stay put. I will hand over to Mohammed immediately so he can run the proceedings. Thank you. Mohammed, it's over to you.
Thank you, Madam Nafisa, and thank you for all the audience and for the panelists, interpreters, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed audience, dear panelists, discussants. Thank you very much for being here today, and let's say good afternoon for all of us to discuss this really important topic that interests us as Africans and people who are concerned African youth about the African potentials and about the African future, and to what extent we as African youth can act upon the African futures from now on. Before I start, I would like to introduce the panelists, the panelists who will be with us today. And of course, we will have Shannon, who is a digital portfolio manager at Afrobarometer organization, who is organizing this wonderful webinar. We have also Farida Bimba, who is an executive director to Gules Civil League. And also we have Luis Kanza, who is international development consultant. We have also Madam Mandiba, who is a governance researcher and development policy analyst. And last but not least, we have Dido Doko, Leadership for Africa scholar. And as a final member in this webinar, we have my little person, who is Mohammed Al-Wazin Hassani, I will be as the moderator, who will also facilitate the word communication between all the panelists and the speakers and all those who want to give an intervention in this webinar. Out of respect, and before we introduce a presentation, a data presentation, Afrobarometer presentation, which will entail some data statistics about education, demographics of Africa, I would like to give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ayubami, Dr. Ayubami, who is a Director, Research Systems Strengthening and Knowledge Mobilization at Mastercard Foundation, in order to give us the welcoming word. Before, just a quick introduction to Dr. Ayubami Ojibodi, who is a Director of Research Systems Strengthening and Knowledge Mobilization at the Mastercard Foundation. There, he coordinates the ideation and the execution of interventions aimed at accompanying the career growth of African young researchers and researchers from indigenous communities living across Canada. He also coordinates the processing of research evidence into formats easily adoptable by policy actors. He is part of a team that ensures that the quality of evidence supporting the work of the Mastercard Foundation is top level. And of course, before joining the Mastercard Foundation, he was a lecturer in the Department of Communication and Language Arts, University of Ibadan in Nigeria. There he rose to the rank of full professor and head of department, and he successfully supervised 12 PhDs and many more master's dissertations before voluntarily retiring in 2023. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ayubami Ojibodi, and I hand the floor to you. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for that introduction. Good afternoon, good morning, distinguished friends, distinguished colleagues. It's indeed my pleasure to be here this time to say welcome to this very important webinar. It's a privilege to be the one to speak on behalf of our foundation, but it gives me a greater privilege to be involved in an event of this type. My welcome remarks will be really brief, and I'd like to just, with your permission, start with a very short story. Some years ago, a group of development experts arrived in the fertile valley of the Zambezi River in Zambia. Their aim was to teach Zambians how to do agriculture around the Zambezi. They want to teach them how to plant tomatoes, and so they gathered these villagers together and taught them how to plant tomatoes. But the villagers were very interested. So they had to bribe them to be interested in the project. They had to pay them. So the villagers eventually cooperated and farms were set up, running into acres. Within a few weeks, the tomatoes began to grow, and they grew even bigger than the parent stock that was imported to Zambia. The experts were very proud, and they began to then teach these villagers and preach to them about agriculture and the importance of agriculture and the importance of being tomato and how they can become millionaires overnight if they would just follow these very important instructions that they were giving them. Good. But one night, about 200 hippos came out of the Zambezi and they ate all of the acres of tomato. The following day, the experts were there and they were totally devastated. But you know what? The villagers were surprised that the experts didn't know anything about the hippos. It was now time for the villagers to lecture our experts. Something like, you thought we were lazy, and you thought we didn't want to do agriculture. You brought your solutions here to come and heal our laziness, right? You are wrong. We don't do agriculture here because we don't want to feed the hippos. You can read the fuller version of this story from a book titled Ripples from the Zambezi by Ernesto Ciroli, one of those development experts. But it's not a strange story. It's not an uncommon story. In fact, the history of development work in Africa is more or less a chronicle of stories of this time. And the lesson is always the same. If you want to work with people, sure, listen to them first. Learn from them. If you want to work with people, don't start by working. Start by listening. Then try to walk a mile in their moccasin. At the Mastercard Foundation, this is what we try to do. We try to do it with passion. To listen to people, to learn from them, and to then learn with them so that we can do with them. The Mastercard Foundation has set for itself an ambitious goal of enabling 30 million young African women and men to access dignified and fulfilling work by the year 2030. 70% of these 30 million would be women. And to make this happen, we're working in 7 African countries and in the region known as the YMO region. We're working in the areas of education, financial inclusion and the markets, agriculture, technology, especially digital technology. There is a section of the foundation known as the Research and Learning section where myself and Vanessa, who's also present here, work. And our aim, our own duty is to support the decisions being made by the foundation with credible and high quality evidence. However, no matter what we do not pretend to know anything on behalf of the young people. For instance, look at our goal to enable young people to access dignified and fulfilling employment. We do not pretend to know what dignified employment is. We do not pretend to know what fulfilling employment is. Rather, we want young people to tell us. This is why, for instance, we have opened up a number of channels to hear from young people. In each of our countries of operation, for instance, we have what we call youth advisory that have been empowered and enabled to challenge us, to critique us, to disagree with us, and to tell us where we go wrong. We also have the youth engagement experts among our colleagues. Part of their work is to create that ambience that allow young people to open up and speak out so that we can learn from them. We also have an emerging series of publications we call Youth Voices series, which help us to harvest the views and perspectives of young people across very specific issues, using different formats and channels. Even with all these that I have enumerated, we still do not think we have listened enough. That is why we continue to partner with an organization like Afrobarometer that is very passionate about harvesting the views and perspectives of citizens. That is why we have continued to support Afrobarometer, and that is why this event is very important for us. We want to learn from the survey that has been conducted. We are interested in the findings. We are interested in what is going on. That is very important. But there is something more important than that. And that is the voices of the people on the panel and people attending this webinar. We want to hear how they engage with the findings. We want to see what they like, what they don't agree with. We do not mind to be told we're wrong, because that is the only way we can be right. At the end of today's event, we're hoping that we would have activated actionable discussions, knowledge exchange, and collaboration that will enable us to address and to understand, and then be part of those addressing the challenges faced by the African youth. I want to close by very specially thanking our partner, Afrobarometer, for what I call the consistency of excellence in the work they have been doing over the years. We are very proud to be associated with. Distinguished friends, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to this webinar. Thank you. Over to you, Mohammed.
Thank you, Professor Ayu. This was a very honoring word from your part, and we are absolutely humbled with it. And of course, after listening to the welcoming word of Professor Ayu, I would like now to go deep further into the crux of the matter that we will discuss today. But in order to put all the audience into the context, into the contextual frame of what we will discuss today, from education to unemployment to other really considerably serious African topics, the floor will be given to Madam Shannon, who will be giving a Afrobarometer data, or let's say statistical data presentation about these topics quantitatively. And of course, before the presentation, allow me to introduce Madam Shannon, the brilliant profile who will be presenting today. And of course, Madam Shannon Van Wykosa is a digital communication strategist, specializing in sociopolitical communications. And of course, she started her career in the advertising industry before moving into social impact sector, where she was worked in behavior change communications, and now occupies the role of Afrobarometer's digital portfolio manager. Shannon holds an undergraduate degree in film and media, specializing in online media production from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and a postgraduate degree in strategic communications from Vega School. She's currently completing a Master of Philosophy in Inclusive Innovation at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business. And her research focuses on the impact of digital democracy in governance processes and the role that digital tools play in extending democratic processes in society. And today, Madam Shannon will be in charge of giving us her presentation. Madam Shannon, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for that lovely welcome, Mohammed. We're going to pull up a presentation that I'm going to take you through today. And while we do that, I just want to give you a little bit of information surrounding Afrobarometer. So we are a Pan-African survey research organization that provides reliable data on the experiences, evaluations, and aspirations of African citizens regarding democracy, governance, and quality of life. Our goal is to give African publics a voice in policy and decision-making. And we started this work in 1999 and have since then completed 8 rounds of surveys in up to 39 countries. And this year, we are currently completing our round 9 survey. On the next slide, you will see a map of where we've worked since our inception. The color codes indicate when we first surveyed the corresponding country. And as you can see, our footprint on the continent is expansive. In terms of our methodology, we use a nationally representative sample of adult citizens. We conduct face-to-face interviews in the language of the respondent's choice. And we use a standard questionnaire which allows comparisons across countries and over time. And our sample size of 1,200 to 2,400 yield country-level results with margins of a sampling error of approximately 2 to 3 percentage points. A little bit about our partnership with the Mastercard Foundation. The Mastercard Foundation partnership with us focuses on youth issues, and it supports Afrobarometer in being able to produce high quality data, widely disseminate data and analysis on the priorities and aspirations of African youth to inform youth development policies and programs across the continent, and to develop a cohort of young researchers, including women, the disadvantaged, and persons with disabilities across the continent who are equipped to analyze data and take up employment opportunities that exist within this environment. It's important to note that the analysis reflects the views of African citizens who were interviewed, and not the Mastercard Foundation or any of Afrobarometer's funders. So let's get into it. We're going to start unpacking some of our key findings. Our first section focuses on the youth's most important problems. As we can see here, unemployment tops the list of the most important problems that young Africans want their government to address, followed by the management of the economy, health, education, and infrastructure. Something to note in our analysis is that there is no significant gender or rural-urban gaps related to youth unemployment. When we look at education level, young Africans are on average more educated than their elders. A majority, which is 66% of 18 to 35-year-olds have at least some secondary school, compared to 52 to 33% of middle and senior age brackets. Our next slide, we're looking at the unemployed youth looking for a job, and this section is disaggregated by age. African youth are considerably more likely than their elders to be out of work and looking for a job. When we look at the same topic, but disaggregated by country, we see that unemployment rates reported by young respondents range up to 67% in Angola and 60% in Botswana and Sao Tome and Principe. But consistently, African governments are graded poorly for their performance in creating jobs. Only 2 in 10 Africans say their government is doing a good job of meeting the needs of creating jobs. Out of the 36 countries surveyed in 2021 and 2022, only 2 countries have majorities approving of their government's performance in creating jobs. And these are Zambia with 72% and Seychelles with 60%. Majorities in the 34 other countries say their governments are doing a poor job. Both young and older respondents offer almost identical assessments of the government's performance. So in the next section, we'll be asking the question, do the youth want democracy? Preference for democracy and rejection of authoritarian rule is high across different generations. Young adults are slightly more likely than their elders to say they are not very satisfied or not at all satisfied with the way that democracy works. When we ask the question of whether the military should intervene when elected leaders abuse power, one troubling sign is the low popular opposition to military intervention in politics. On average, across 36 countries, only 42% agree that militaries should never intervene in politics, while a small majority, 53%, are willing to countenance this option if elected leaders abuse power. The view that the military should intervene if elected officials abuse their power is more popular among younger generations. Close to 6 in 10, 56%, of those under 36 years old, compared to 46% among those over 56 years old. In the next section, we're going to delve into how much trust youth have in their leaders. When we look at perceived corruption among institutions compared to the elderly, citizens, the youth are particularly more critical of institutional corruption. In terms of trust in government and social institutions, here too, the youth show considerably more distrust in public institutions than the elders. And now we're going to be looking at participation in change-making activities. Afrobarometer measures citizen engagement in a range of dimensions. How often they discuss politics, their participation in elections and in civic or community events, and their participation in demonstrations. When we look at analysis on who's voted in recent elections, the youth are less likely to be politically engaged than older citizens. The largest groups are observed in the most fundamental form of voice and participation, voting, which allows a 20% percentage point gap between the youth and those above 55 years. When we look at civic engagement, they also lag behind in other types of community participation, like attending community meetings, and this is 43% versus 54%, and joining others to raise issues. Here we're looking at 39% versus 45%, but are more likely than the elders to join demonstrations. So here we're looking at 10% versus 6%. In terms of contact with leaders, they are also less likely to contact their leaders to discuss important problems. On our next slide, we see that young women are even less likely to be engaged in the political process than their male peers. We also see huge gender gaps in how often the youth contact their political or traditional leaders. When we look at the youth political and civic engagement by a rural-urban location, we break this down, the youth's participation according to rural-urban locations. We find that rural youth are more likely to vote in elections, attend community meetings, and join others in their communities to raise issues. These are at par with their urban peers when it comes to discussing politics and taking part in demonstrations. And finally, on our last slide, we see that youth in rural areas are also more likely than their urban peers to engage with political and traditional leaders. So in conclusion, the latest Afrobarometer data from 36 African countries reveal that unemployment is the biggest problem that youth are facing. African governments are poorly rated for their efforts in creating jobs. The youth are more likely than their elders to express dissatisfaction with democracy, mistrust in elected leaders, and willingness to access military intervention of elected leaders who abuse power. The youth report lower rates of political engagement than their elders across a variety of indicators, including voting in national elections. And young women's political engagement lags behind that of their male peers across all the indicators under consideration. Thank you very much. That is the end of our presentation. Mohammed, I'm going to hand over to you so we can have an insightful discussion surrounding this data.
Well, thank you, Madam Shannon, for the super interesting presentation. For me, all the statistics were superbly paramount to contemplate because they are reflecting and they are mirroring the African youth perspective towards their governance, towards their democracy, and also toward the social policy that is, in a way or another, they are obliged abide by and to stick to. Yet, just my my question, like when I was listening to your intervention and seeing all the figures and all the numbers, I asked myself just a question, contemplative question, which is, do we as African youth, do we have the macro vision of on the world as Africans and our relation with the world? Africa is the potential of the world. Africa is from now on, everyone is yearning for Africa, but we as Africans, as African youth, we have to do our best in order to avoid another phase of neocolonialism. By chance, we have all the resources for the upcoming artificial intelligence industry, and all of it are now happening and available in Africa. So we have to do all the best to avoid all the atrocities. Apart from that, we are hoping for the best, especially when we have such a great African youth like you and like all the panelists we have, who can have the light and guide the crowd. In order to get deep into the topic as well from other facets, we have other interesting panelists who can provide us with their perspectives, with their views, and I would like to start with Madam Doku, who will give us her intervention regarding the topic. And before to hand the floor for her, I would like to introduce her. And Madam Dido Doku is currently at DART, German Academic Exchange Service, hello colleague, Leadership for Africa scholar and committed to good works. Her experience spans governments, private and not-for-profit sectors. Most recently, Dido worked as operations manager at a financial technology startup for the Ghana and Nigeria offices. She led a cross-functional team of finance, human resources, and customer success personnel to ensure seamless day-to-day business functions. Dido entered the public service as a member of the inaugural Emerging Public Leaders Ghana cohort, a public service fellowship program seeking to empower the next generation of young professionals. She served as a budget analyst at the Ministry of Finance of the Republic of Ghana. Prior to that, she worked as a public-private partnerships associate at Lead for Ghana. Today, she aspires to do work at the intersection of public and private internships that is focused on sustainable urban infrastructure and expanded opportunities for social mobility. Of course, we will know more about Dido's perspective regarding this topic that we are discussing for the moment, and I would like to give the floor to Madam Dido. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for this kind introduction. And thank you, Shannon, for sharing these, as Mohammed said, just echoing him, very paramount details about really the pulse test of what as the citizens feel about our economy and our respective countries. For me, just thinking through the sum of your presentation, I think it's really speaking to youth's dissatisfaction with governance, with the ability of our governments to be able to really provide key services and key infrastructure for us, of which employment is most pertinent, because employment really does feature into the way in which you can engage with your world, the ways in which you can improve your own standards of living. I think it also speaks to a dissatisfaction with the processes within democracy to redress when we feel as though there's bad governance. And I think that's why we see that there's tons of youth that are dissatisfied with democracy, because the ways to redress when we feel like there's either an abuse of power or hold our elected officials accountable seem to be very either unclear or arduous or meddle with corruption themselves, because who checks the people in charge when you have these systems of executive, judiciary, and parliamentary that are all very unclear what the processes should be. My expectations, I would say, for those conversations that we really are able to continue this dialogue in a meaningful way, to be able to really speak to how we as youth, as critical stakeholders of our economies, because we are looking at our economies that we are going to inherit, and we're seeing them devolve before our very eyes. And I think that's why youth have higher percentage of dissatisfaction as well, because we're seeing economies that we will now be managing, we will now be living in, and there's nothing, it seems, that we can do about it at this time. But I think that's a false notion. I think that we as youth are definitely critical stakeholders. We are able to mobilize and organize to really build on the future and influence and impact these policies that we want to see. So I'm excited to be here and to have this conversation. Thank you very much, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Madam Dido. And yeah, it was really interesting that you gave us your perception about this topic. Of course, we have to move on as quick as possible to the next speaker, who will give us his perception. And this time we will go to Madam Farida Bimba, who is a democracy and human rights activist and a writer from Togo. And she is the executive director of the Togolese Civil League, an NGO that works to advance democracy, the rule of law, and equality in Togo. Madam Farida, please go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thank you all for being here today. I'd like to extend my gratitude to Afrobarometer for putting this event together. The conversation we are having today is falling in a very interesting context. In West Africa, more specifically, we have seen in the past couple of days the tension that is rising with the situation in Niger, where the army deposed the government that was elected. And the tendency of militaries taking over in West Africa region has been growing in recent years. And this is leading to a lot of questions about whether young people on this continent want change, if they want democracy or not. Because when we follow the level of celebration that we see in the streets of Niamey, Bamako, Burkina, Ouagadougou, and many others, you have the impression that the young generation is completely disillusioned with democracy and electoral governance, and will rather side with militaries. But I believe that when we approach the situation this way, we kind of forget a few things. In many parts of this continent, the young people are left to fend for themselves. The conditions in which they are living are deteriorating by the day. There is growing insecurity, growing inequality, and absence of basic services. The total failure of our government to be able to provide and deliver on those basic services, and it has literally created an environment of discontent where the masses, the young people are left completely to provide for themselves and be able to guarantee their own healthcare, their own education, and even delivering on basic services such as water, electricity, and many others. So this feeling of abandonment is causing a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, especially because many of these governments cannot be held accountable. Many are extremely authoritarian in the way they rule. They suppress the youth in the streets when they take their protests there, because in the past 10 years, the continent of Africa has witnessed the highest amount of uprisings in the world. We had some governments that even were deposed in the process. So But those protests tend to be met with massive repression, complete closure of the civic space. The young people are not allowed to express themselves. Activists are arrested and killed. Journalists are persecuted. The internet is banned in some countries. Social media is banned when the citizens are using them to raise their voices about poor governance and poor leadership. As a result of this, the young people have become extremely radicalized. They want change by all means. And in the end, we cannot blame them, because when you have growing poverty and especially insecurity in countries like the Sahel, where terrorist groups have been causing havoc in many parts of the countries, you cannot actually accuse these young people to take a chance at freedom. They want decent lives, they want dignified lives, and they want it by all means. And they have actually tried. They have believed in the democratic process and they continue to believe in it. But then they don't think that the current government are delivering on this democracy. And the other aspect that I want to touch on before moving on quickly is the way that poor governance and poorly elected regimes have been normalized on this continent as democracy. When you look at the situation in many parts of the continent where international institutions are condemning military coups, which is actually reasonable because it's a violation of all international treaties signed by most countries. When we actually pay attention to those, we are actually forgetting that there are regimes that claim to have been elected, but that are nothing but democratic regimes. We have some regimes that have been there for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Same family ruling in countries like Togo, Cameroon, Chad, and Gabon. You have leaders that have mastered the art of frauding elections and they get away with it. There are no consequences. We have seen some elections becoming extremely violent with thousands of people killed in the process. So young people have lost faith in the electoral process. Then in addition to that, you have leaders that claim to be elected. Some are not. But then as elected leaders, they do not act as democracies in the way they govern. The corruption is very rampant. The press is completely destroyed. As a result, you have people left in situations where they cannot accountable. As a result of these challenges and these issues, young people on these continents are becoming completely dissatisfied with even the use of the term democracy, because what is being sold to them, the countries that we considered as ideal models of democracy out there, if their citizens will be willing to accept the type of democracy that is being sold to the African youth and masses.
Madam Farida?
So I'm going to stop there and I hope to continue the conversation with you all.
Yeah, okay. So, thank you very much, Madam Farida, for your interesting word and for your valid criticism as well, and for your explanation. This was really beneficial. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the next speaker, who is Madam Louise Kanza, of course, who is an international award-winning activist and specializing in community engagement and developments based in Democratic Republic of the Congo. Madam Louise, please, you have the floor, and we are all ears for your perception.
Thank you, Mohammed, and thank you very much to Afrobarometer for setting up this webinar and inviting me to be a speaker. I'm going to quickly start with highlighting the fact that, yes, I'm from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is one of the countries that has not been surveyed yet by Afrobarometer. And despite that, I find many similarities in the findings, which just goes to tell us that there is a disturbing trend among the dissatisfaction or the experiences or the life experiences in general of the youth across the continent. So when you look at the title of the webinar, and if you are as problematic as I proudly am, and you, the first word already, understanding, gives you the impression that we are misunderstood, or what the point that we're trying to put across is very difficult, and the concepts that we use are very hard to grasp when actually it's not. So my interventions will be primarily using practical examples to prove this, to prove that we are not as difficult. We as the youth are not as difficult as everyone seems to think that we are. And we are not just complaining. We have practical examples of things that we have done to put ourselves out of many situations. I primarily think that a lot of our problems as well are based on lack of togetherness and lack of Pan-Africanism, which the youth have understood. We cannot ignore the scenes that we have been seeing of what is currently happening in Tunisia, and that we have seen often with migrants in the Northern African region, where migrants from sub-Saharan Africa are really treated as less than humans within our own continent. We also cannot ignore that we have a lot of civil unrest on the continent, specifically the Democratic Republic of Congo, who are currently in a David and Goliath battle that should affect the entire continent, because as long as the unrest continues, then our problems will also continue. So I think it's very important for me to highlight those two factors and to show how they are causing a lot of instability because of the lack of togetherness and the fact that there are more reasons on the continent to feel like we are apart than we are together. And I think throughout the webinar, can we just always keep this in mind? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Louise. This was really enlightening from your part, and since we have listened to all perceptions of our panelists, I would like now to have a recourse all together to open up the rounds of questions. And of course, the first rounds of question, we will start with the topic of unemployment. Unemployment, this ogre problem, which is prevailing in the African continent and is really discerning for us as African youth. The Afrobarometer. But sorry, before the question series, I did a mistake. My apologies, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, we had to listen to Madam Mandipa, and of course, she's most welcome to give us her perception also. Madam Mandipa, who is a governance researcher and development policy analyst whose research and consulting experience spans multi-stakeholder and the multi-sectoral fora. Madam Mandipa, my apologies first, and you have the floor second.
Forgotten, but not last but not forgotten. You know, I'm going to push us forward in the conversation a bit. And today we're talking about unemployment. And I'm just going to speak just a little bit into the insight that I see on the pressing challenge on Africa's youth today. And for me, it is a call from top down rather than from bottom up. And it's a call to see the crisis for capacity and dormant potential. But the one thing that I have not seen addressed in the presentation from Afrobarometer and with my fellow panelists is, what is the purpose of a job or employment? Why is it so important? So I rustled together some answers from my end, and I came up with this. So employment is generally the most important means of obtaining adequate economic resources, essential for material well-being and full participation in society while catering to psychosocial wellness. So it's essentially what we're talking about today is a human right and not a privilege, as it's often pitted to be by our leaders. So let's run through the dormant potential that I'm speaking about in terms of numbers and how Africa has the capacity to gain economically and to benefit from humanizing its people, because I've often seen that you have to bargain a bit with our leaders and show them how they stand to benefit. It shouldn't be like that, but it is what it is. So I think when people talk about, by 2030, things like this are going to happen, and one believes it's a long way away. It's in 7 years. And I'm sure everybody on this panel and listening in was still an adult 7 years ago, right? So in 7 years, young Africans are expected to constitute 42%. That's almost half of global youth and account for 75% of those under 35 in Africa. And if you understand anything about working age populations, that's a prime place to be. The total working age population of the continent is expected to grow by 70% by 2035. And by 2050, Africa is expected to house more than 461 million young people aged between 15 to 25. By that time, Africa will form a quarter of the world's labor force, right? So within 3 generations, 41% of the world's youth will be Africans. So we're not talking about a demographic that is shoved into the corner. That won't matter in terms of global policy and lobbying and governance building and effectiveness and economic coherence for the continent going forward. If you're talking about a strong Africa, you have to pay attention to this demographic. I'm going to pull more data for you from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation 2023 report, where 26.1% of Africa's youth fit into the non-employed, non-educated, and non-trained bracket. So that's the NEET bracket. Only Angola and Madagascar are the 2 African countries that have that percentage at less than 10%. So 26% does not sound like a big number when you are looking at populations such as the Netherlands, where I live. But when you're looking at the African continent, that's a lot of people. And given the sheer number of young Africans in Africa compared to the rest of the world, these numbers indicate a seriously blooming crisis. So even though this generation is more educated than their leaders, they're considerably less likely to find employment because their skills do not match market leads. Africa is still not spending per capita globally what it should be investing in education. And this shows in the trends on the continent. Although scholarship opportunities such as the Mastercard Foundation, which has given $8.6 billion primarily to young Africans in education since 2006, many are, as Afrobarometer data from 2016 and 2018 round notes, the largest population that has considered migrating or end up being absorbed by other markets, and their skills are useful elsewhere. This then really leads one to wonder what kind of working age force we're nurturing on the continent and where our priorities are. And if we have the youth demographic resource, why are we not doing more to grow it and preserve it? So essentially, my interventions today will focus on the fact that it is often forgotten that youthfulness in and of itself is expungible. It will be eradicated the older you get, and a new generation of young people will come in. It also reproduces itself in toxicity or productivity, dependent on what you nurture at the time. So the youth demographic that suffers today will be a generation of young Africans that is only equipped to suffer tomorrow, and the cycle will reproduce itself.
Thank you so much, Mandepa, for your well-explanatory intervention, and which was really enlightening. Now we go forward to the question section, and the first question section, as I mentioned earlier, sets of questions that has to do with unemployment. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Afrobarometer organization data shows that unemployment is the most pressing challenge facing today's youth. What are some of the insights you can share with us in your various capacities? And of course, I will start with with Miss Farida. Please, what are some of the insights you can share with us in your various capacities? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. But if you will allow me, because I have to go in 5 minutes, I wanted to answer a question that was asked in the chat before departing, if that is okay with you.
Yes, no problem. If you can be just quick.
Yes. So the question was about how do we find what are the useful involvement of the international community, considering that governments tends to infringe on political rights and repress youth protests. And to that question, I want to say that there is a complete I wouldn't want to use the term refusal, but then there is a way that international institutions have been extremely biased in the way they respond to violations and attacks on democracy. In many countries on the continent, we have seen some elections being conducted in the most unfair way whatsoever, with a lot of fraud, with all indicators, all international observation group attesting that the process was completely flawed, unfair, and non-transparent. But there are no consequences to those who commit such attacks on democracy. In addition, when they take charge and then eventually unleash massive repression on the masses, they violate freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and many others. There are still no sanctions. There is no attacks. There is no call for them to stop violating civil rights. The only time that we see those sanctions falling immediately is when the government actually are deposed. So it seems like these international treaties care more about protecting the leaders than they care about protecting the masses. So we want a more a better way of international institutions actually addressing the issues of human rights violations and infringements on democracy. We cannot be told that it cannot be done, because we have seen those institutions do it when it comes to countries that seem to not be falling in line with Western nations ideologically. And I'll see the example of Belarus, also Belarusia, I think that's the word in English. My French is playing. I'll set the example of Venezuela, also the example of Nicaragua. So why is it that when regimes that seems to be close to Russia are violating human rights, or conducting unfair elections and rigging elections, they get sanctions? And then when we have dictators doing this on this African continent, they get away with it. In addition to that, Western nations and international institutions have always so-called put stability before democracy, but they don't understand that when you don't have rule of law, you cannot guarantee the stability. Massive amount of money has actually been invested in military efforts on the West African region and on the continent overall. And recently, when you look at programs launched by the US government, for example, they actually are putting 2,000 times more money into the armies than they are putting in civil society. They have countless of programs to build the capacity of the army, to equip them, to reinforce them, to fight, they say, terrorism. But in the end, interestingly, of all the 5 coups that were successful in Africa in the past 6 years, every single one of them, all their leaders were trained, received capacity enhancement in the United States, for example, whether it is in the putsch in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger as well. So what does that say? we are equipping the army to become stronger, and then we are completely bypassing civil society, supporting civil society. So it is important to actually invest in the masses, to invest in the people, to invest in the citizens being able to hold their governments accountable, and to give them a push as well, the same way a push is given to those leaders when they are facing tribulations from the military. So in the conclusion, what I'm going to say is that the international community has to really understand that there must be a more transparent way in the way they respond to attacks on rights. They must also stop being subjective and only doing it when it works for their interests. They cannot be good dictators and bad ones. They cannot be useful dictators and bad ones. All of them must be fought with the same level of force and energy. And until we guarantee that, we'll continue frustrating the masses, and we'll continue proving to the people that we don't really care about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Farida, for your explanatory answer. This was very beneficial, knowledge-wise. Regarding unemployment, I would like to address the same question. What are some of the insights you can share with us in your various capacities? So different perspective, bearing in mind that Africa has the world's youngest youth population who are considerably more educated than previous generation. Mandeepa, what can you say about this question? The floor is yours.
I think I've already given my views on this. I'm going to defer to my fellow panelists, and then we'll come back on the round of questions.
Okay. So I will now come to you, Louise, for your initial thoughts on unemployment and the key drivers. Would you enlighten us?
Thank you, Mohammed. I think one of the key drivers of unemployment has to be just the traditional African way of seeing employment or education in general. And anyone who was raised in an African household will know that there were a few noble careers that you would be pushed towards studying, and we were raised with that notion that you have to study in order to get a job. So these were sort of like unconfirmed guarantees that we were informed that we were going to get. And now we are more educated. Yes, we have studied, but we still don't have jobs. Why is it so important for us to focus on this fact of us having unemployment? Is because since we are brought up to have this perspective, those who do get unemployment, for those who do find employment is seen as the be all and end all. And then when we get to employment, we don't focus on the problem with the employment conditions, the problem with pay, the problem with people living basically just to pay their bills. So employment on its own is also not necessarily might not necessarily be the solution that we're looking for, because of the entire system being flawed and our education not moving at the same pace as what the world needs, and that now more educated people are going to look for jobs abroad because they feel like they will be more appreciated, they will be better compensated abroad as well. And this also shows in the way our governments respond to us being more educated. I mean, how do we trust a government, and how do we trust our own education when somebody in a high place in government would not want to be treated in the local hospitals by the local doctors in their own countries and would rather go abroad? I mean, they don't even have faith in our tertiary institutions. They send their own children abroad to study, and not they don't send them to study at home. So when we speak of a flawed system, it really is flawed and corrupt from the ground up. And it's not, as I said, youth always complaining and youth always not finding solutions. We do find solutions, especially with globalization and everything evolving, we have seen the use of technology to try to get governments just to be accountable and just to be transparent and actually just to trust themselves, because they don't trust themselves. So we cannot trust them at all. We've seen the Arab Spring in North America. We saw fees must fall in South Africa. And recently we saw NSARS in Nigeria with the elections that they had this year as well. So we have people that are changing the constitution to suit them. We have people that cut the internet when it suits them during elections or during any time they feel like they're going to be exposed. So we really don't have any type of competence when it comes to dealing with the topic. And the more we move forward, it's like we're moving back. And just like Mandipa said, we are going to be going around in circles, and we are doomed to repeat the same errors that those who are currently in power are going to make, because we've been set a trap, basically. And even if we do speak out, we are still not given the platform, and we're still not given the capacity to address the issues that we have.
Thank you, Luis. This must be taken into consideration, of course. And last but not least, to Ms. Dido, as a DAD scholar, what is your take on the critical issue of unemployment? Like, in other words, what are the strategies to address and to resolve this? You have the floor.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think, to bear the risk of echoing all the panelists before me, I would say that we are at this issue of unemployment, and it's really just an indicator of the larger governance issue. And I think with the examples that a lot of our panelists have given, we see that governance as a whole is breaking down in African economies. And the issue of unemployment is but one indicator of the fact that we are really suffering from a poor governance issue across our countries, across our continents, due to poor democracy. But I think it's also important to distinguish between what is poor democracy and what is really bad governance, and how we can resolve these issues of bad governance in our countries. In terms of strategies, I'll be remiss to say that there is quite a lot being done already, right? We have our partner Mastercard is doing the Young Africa work, sponsoring about 30 million Africans to work in 2030. I think the issue that we have is that we have reached that boiling point where this issue has been so exacerbated that anything that is being done by any single stakeholder is really seen as too little being done too soon. So even in the context of Ghana, we have World Bank sponsoring skills and jobs projects. We have 15,000 youth being trained and educated. 15,000 is but a drop in the bucket of the millions of people that still need work. And for me, I think we still need to fall back to, and I think Louise mentioned this wonderfully, that Pan-African sense, but also that real multi-stakeholder approach of solving this national, Pan-African, international problem of having millions of unemployed youth, not just being let loose in our countries, but across the world. We're having this here of people who are really not having chances to, as Mandipa said, have economic resources, navigate and engage with the world that is around them. And for me, what has been interesting in this conversation, whenever we hear these issues of employment, is yes, we talk about government, we talk about governments and its international partners. I would be very interested in, as a strategy, a conversation going down a bit more to the micro level. But when we talk about jobs, government can train, government can provide all these supply-sided initiatives, but who hires? Private sector hires, right? So how are we bringing private sector into this conversation? How are we talking to private sector saying that we need to figure out how do we build more jobs in these industries? What are these critical industries that we actually need to be building jobs in? When we go to private sector, off the top of my head, I'm sure some of the answers would be, we don't have enough money, right, to hire these people. So what are we doing about our banking institutions, about our access to liquidity, about our finances? How are we bringing those people into the conversation as well to say that we need to actually, in the context of Ghana, majority of our banks invest in government bonds, right? So you have amazing youth initiatives for business. You have amazing industries that could be invested in, but they're deemed as risky. So how are we engaging our banking sectors? How are we engaging our private sectors to say that this is a national problem that affects every single stakeholder, and we all need to be involved in solving this? Last but not least, I think we have our most critical stakeholder, and Louise pointed at this, right? Our tertiary institutions, our universities, our TVETs have been giving us, as we've all seen, outmoded forms of curriculum for the work of the future that we are now in. And so how are we really engaging these universities as well? How are we putting pressure on them to say, we need to revamp our education systems? We actually need to have better partnerships with universities and industry so that when we're going to school, we know that we're actually learning relevant information. Right? And these are all people that we need to be bringing to the table. I think when we speak about just putting pressure on government, we really limit the dynamic of solutions that we can bring to the table. Let's engage universities, let's engage banks, let's engage private sector. We can solve these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Dido. This was very interesting. Actually, despite I am a little bit skeptical about the sector the private sector and the recruiting process, because private sectors require stable financial governments. Unfortunately, we have, for example, 15 countries in Africa. The financial stability is controlled by other financial entities outside Africa. And this is something really to take into consideration. But still, ladies and gentlemen, we will be reading your questions and, of course, trying to answer them. And, of course, all the panelists will try to answer them. We have DBB, who is asking what skills are required in the current African job market, which is going alongside with the point of unemployment. So anonymous attendee is asking, the data given is very impressive, and he is asking about how can I get the Kenyan data. And there's also a question addressed for Miss Farida, which is already answered. There's a Prince who is asking, how will we able to interact with other young people from the other countries in Africa on this call? So looking for, are these findings shared with individual countries? So this is another question. Okay, are there indications regarding the impact of corruption on unemployment? What kind of relationship, if any, is there between the two? This is a very valid and legitimate question, actually. Also, Mr. Solomon DBB is asking, while a lot of unemployment is deeply affecting most of the young people in Africa, what really makes the respective countries in Africa not change the scenario? Is it the lack of resource, knowledge, will, or what exactly? What is the perspective of the youth on this? So any insights from the panelists on the four red questions? What is your take about these questions, or are associated to the problem of unemployment and job market requirements? Mandeepa, you have the floor.
Thank you. I will touch on the issue of corruption. Over the last 50 years, Africa is estimated to have lost in excess of $1 trillion in illicit financial flows. Just try and imagine what $1 trillion could have done for your country, for your community, in terms of infrastructure building, education investment, and other developmental investment issues going forward. The sum is roughly equivalent, this $1 trillion is roughly equivalent to all the official developmental assistance received by Africa in that exact same time frame. And at the same time, just speaking to what Dido was just speaking about with the private sector often has its hands tied as well. 40.4% of the amount of Africa's external debt is owed to the private sector, and that was a 2021 figure, which is not too far off. It had already felt the shock of COVID. So it is the mismanagement of funds and the mismanagement of governance within that funds and the lack of accountability and the process to redress not being clear that I think as well Dido had mentioned, that causes what Farida had mentioned, a sense of abandonment and youth frustration. And when we see youth protesting, when we see young people rising up and saying no and saying enough is enough, we often feel it as civic participation. It is very folly to rest on the fact that young people are going to come in and be proactive when in fact you're measuring them on reactiveness. And this is the problem with the ripple effects of corruption. You then have public external debt being placed in the hands of private sector or in external donors, or just basically being externalized. And it really brings us into the question around democracy and governance, which I want to steer us to. It's really about institutions that work, right? It's really around the fact that aspirations for democracy are high. The full data set over 10 years shows a decline in every single aspect of measuring that democracy. So we've got a problem and we need to fix it.
This was clear, Mandipa, and it needs a reflection about that. Regarding the questions about from where can we get the data, and of course, we will just deal with the question of the data, and I will give the floor. The questions of the data will be answered by Madam Shannon, and then I will give the floor afterwards to Luis. Shannon, you have the floor.
Thanks, Mohammed. Yeah, we've received quite a few questions in the chat about where you can access the data. So this presentation will be uploaded to our website. So keep an eye on the site and you'll be able to find it. But just in general, we have an online data analysis tool on our website, which allows you to go through all of our rounds. So we've got all of our rounds of data uploaded. We're currently in the process of uploading round 9, but we have quite a lot of the country data surrounding that already. And really, this tool is amazing because you're able to do your own analysis on our site. And then if you're looking for finished pieces of analysis, we've got our publication section, which gets updated on a daily basis. And you'll be able to search according to topics and countries and rounds, which correspond to specific years. So for all of those questions in the chat, please head over to our site and you'll be able to find a wealth of data.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon, for your answer. The floor is given to Luis. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mohammed. And I would like to respond to any questions that concern sort of the skill set that is needed that we should be moving towards. And I think that that shouldn't be an issue that we should be focused on, because as time evolves, the goalpost keeps moving. So today we can say that, I don't know, IT is a skill that we need to develop, but then in 10 years' time, it's going to be something else. And the crux of the matter is that we are not evolving quickly enough to be focused on these types of issues. And there are so many external factors that contribute towards the employment. And it sort of gives life to this notion that you're going to go to school and you're going to get a job. There are no guarantees when it comes to that. I don't know why we still are telling people that this is what they need to do. Your life is to be born, to go to school, you get a job, and you'll be able, if you do well at school, you'll be able to get a job, which is not true. I'm going to give you an example of the context of a young girl whose education is already not prioritized because the family is not going to invest in a girl's education because they say to themselves, well, she's just going to marry off someone and we won't be able to benefit from that, whether it's from black tax or just from pride in general. And you'll find that this girl will find ways to put herself through education, through empowerment, maybe from a bursary or maybe from an exchange program. And then they will have this degree after they have defied all the odds. And then they get to somewhere where they're supposed to be offered a job, and they are in a situation where they are in a sex for jobs type of situation, which has been exposed multiple times on the continent, or they're faced with sexual harassment. So all of these problems are based on the fact that she is a woman, and not on the fact that she doesn't have the right skill set, or she doesn't have she's not smart enough, she didn't go to school. All of that doesn't matter in that type of a context. So every time we have to look at the bigger picture, we have to look at all the factors. There are so many, but I think for the context of this webinar, we can see that it's all going back to bad governance, because if women are not seen in the right light in society today, it's because, yes, of the socioeconomic, the social cultural, the psychosocial factors, but it goes back to bad governance. So I think under that umbrella, we can start, we can focus our questions more based on that.
Thank you, Luis. This was clear and worth reflection. So going to the second axis of our questions today, the sets of questions, and the second group of questions is oriented towards democracy and governance. So let's shift to this topic. And the Afrobarometer's round 9 findings reveal that compared to the elders, African youth are more likely to express dissatisfaction with democracy, mistrust their leaders, and indicate a willingness to access military interventions. And I would like to start with Mandeepa as a governance policy expert. What can be done to strengthen governance processes to win back the confidence of the youth in their governance?
Thank you, Mohammed. You know, I always like to remind people that, you know, this question, what can be done, is not a single answer, single shot type of question, or requires an answer. It's very multi-pronged, it's multi-layered. And I'm going to go back to the fact that, you know, corruption, inadequate infrastructure, education not matching skills needs, food insecurity, which we haven't spoken about on this panel, but still remains at the core of this, mismanagement of the economy, and other pressing issues are not separated from the top-cited problems of under and unemployment in Africa, right? What the 37% of youth respondents are echoing is a culmination of various challenges that contribute to their economic precarity and contribute to environments that allow governance to falter and confidence to wane. So the one thing that I want to bring up is that accountability has to be backed by positive demonstrations for peace if we're going to look at eradicating instability, right? So we can't analyze the rise of militarized influences on governance in Africa without measuring the temperature on the ground. We often believe that we are when we engage in surveys, when we engage with lobby groups, with civil society, but often these groups work in silos. These data sets are shared in silos, and we need to be more proactive about bringing together the information that we have, mainstreaming it, and making sure that we're looking at proactive rather than reactive solutions. As well, with only 20% of youth believing that their governments create an environment for job creation, compared to 53% that believe that the military should intervene when selected leaders abuse power, it's clear that the appetite for most of Africa's application of passive democracy and underlined passive democracy is ever lessening. It's getting worse. And a craving for a perceived definitive action through military interventions or some form of structure is increasing. So it comes, again, as Farida said, from the sense of abandonment that results in frustration and a desperate need for action and for proactiveness from governance, or from governments or people that govern, or leaders in general. So this is also in line with Afrobarometer data, taking us all the way back to data sets as far back as 2018, where in South Africa, 62% of South Africans were willing to give up democratic freedoms in exchange for job security. It's a real shame if our leaders do not proactively act given these warning signs. The reason we elect them is so that they act. And the rest of Africa is not immune to the ripple effects of what's happening in the Sahel. It goes back to the question you asked right at the beginning, Mohammed, do the youth see this macro vision for Africa in the next few years? I think that question is a privilege for many young people struggling to make ends meet, right? So in terms of bringing back that confidence, we need to make sure that Maslow's hierarchy of needs is met, essentially. And the youth need to be tangibly reassured that their leaders are working for them and not against them, or else they go into survival mode. And that's exactly what's made them lose confidence. And what has made them go into survival mode is waning governance structures and institutions that don't work for them.
Thank you, Mandeepa. This is quite interesting to hear, and of course the macro vision definitely is a privilege amid the circumstances you mentioned, but still we will be facing other black futures if we didn't have a macro vision. Switching to Dido, and regarding democracy and governance, what do you believe are the root causes of these sentiments? The sentiments of mistrust in the leaders and in the leading process.
I would say that Louise has sort of began that conversation or touched on that conversation when she speaks about the fact that the future that we as youth were promised has in effect been a lie, right? We all grew up being told, go to school, get good grades, there's a job assured for you. That may have been the truth of the generations before us. We're growing up into a world where we have done the things that we were told to do. We were obedient, we were following through the processes that were established and guaranteed an outcome of employment, and that has broken. We're not finding the employment after doing everything that we were told to do. So there's this immense dissatisfaction, and also tied in with that mistrust, right? I did what I was asked to do by my elders, and I've been in a position where I'm supposed to benefit from my following of the instructions, from my really going through these processes that they told me will lead to this outcome, and nothing has happened. And what are they doing about the fact that nothing has happened? Not enough, not much, nothing at all. So I think we're seeing that these root causes are coming out of this, but also to touch on what Mandeepa said about just bad governance, we're also seeing that in as much as there's bad governance, there's also this failure of processes within democracy, as I had mentioned before, to redress this. Like when you have a case where you are dissatisfied with your minister for parliament, you're dissatisfied with your local councillor, you're dissatisfied with your president, what do? These tools of redress are either unclear, we don't know what to do, they're too arduous, right? Recently I asked and I found out that you have to have a referendum in Ghana where 75% of the people vote to oust the president before the president is ousted. That is too expensive and too much of a tax for any people to take on if we actually have issues with our democracy. And you have these issues where also whenever you attempt to redress, the process of redress may themselves even be corrupted, because you go report to your local councillor, but you have the instance where your local councillor is more accountable to the party that funded them to be in position, or to the party that is keeping them in their position, than to you, who they're supposed to represent. So all around you really realize that there is no solution for bad governance except for what we've seen in our histories, which is that of military deposition. Which is why you have a lot of these youth saying, we want coups, because that is the only thing that we see works. Do we actually want coups? What we want is an end of bad governance, but a coup is the only way that we can see to accomplish that.
Yes, thank you, Dido. And let's take some questions from the chat regarding this topic. I would like to, let's say, where is it exactly? Yeah, I would like to have this question that was addressed regarding democracy. The root cause of this military outrage is institutional caught by some do-nothing authoritarian elders in Africa, but in alliance with imperialist West, something that I really stand for. That cannot be called democracy. It is kleptocracy and outright thuggery. And also, I have another word in political sciences, they call it political agency. So you work as an agent for other people who are lobbying for themselves. Well, the recent questions, like all of them deal with the problem of unemployment. Yes, Mr. Sadiq Houri, and he's asking a question. How can we enable ourselves and our youth in large numbers to actively engage in governance and actively participate in how their country's affairs are run? Very legitimate question. Luis, would you like to intervene?
Thank you. And thank you so much for that question, because I think a lot of us are always, we feel like we're sitting in these webinars and we're not coming up with practical solutions. But earlier on, I gave 3 very good examples of how the youth have been engaged in large numbers to call for action and to call for change. So the first example was the Arab Spring that happened in 2011 in North Africa. The second example was the Fees Must Fall protest in South Africa. And the third example was the EndSARS process, the EndSARS protest that happened in Nigeria recently, and also how they live documented the entire election process in the month of February, if I'm not mistaken. So what happens in a sense is that we are trying to make everything as transparent and make everyone accountable, but this is seen as disrespect, because when we look at people that are running governments the way they run their families, we do not have a voice. We should not have a voice as youth, and we should do as we are told, which is one of the big problems that we have. Now, I don't understand, because our disrespect or this hard-headedness of ours does not come from us today. We inherited it from them. If you look at how a lot of the people that are in power today were also youth activists, and they were also in the streets. There's a lot of martyrs as well amongst them. They lost a lot of their compatriots as well. So they should be able to relate to us. Now, I don't know why they are not relating, why they are not able to put themselves in our shoes or change things today so that you know, they could get the results that they were looking for back then. It really, really baffles me. I mean, I know that I'm talking about things that happened half a century ago, and these people that are in power today, fine, I acknowledge they may have health issues that don't allow them to remember that they were also once in our shoes, but we really need them to want to take them seriously, because the way they behave like people that not only don't trust themselves, but they don't want to gain our trust. And the mistake that we make is thinking that, no, these people want suggestions, they want our voice, they want our opinions, when in reality they don't. So if they want us to trust them, they need to make themselves trustworthy, and they need to want to be trusted. Okay, so it all starts with them having the desire for this to happen. And the reason why we're here today is because they don't want to. They simply don't want to. Even if you've been to any type of high-profile event, you'll see that they give this quota to the youth. And even when they have intergenerational dialogue, they prepare the questions, or they want to beforehand know what you're going to ask them so that they can prepare for this, just so that they can give you, you know, that time and say, you know, we did it. You know, they tick it off their list and say that we had the youth participating. So I think it's also important to know that as much as these people need ideas from us, they need input from us, they know exactly what they have to do. And all they have to do is actually do it.
Yes, Luis, clean and clear, of course. I totally agree with all what you have stated. As a final section before we wrap up this great webinar, this enlightening, full of knowledge webinar, I would like to acknowledge the participants, of course. Sorry. Yes, just regarding absolutely. I would like just to address a thanking word for those who have been raising their hands from the participants, from the attendees. For example, our friend here, Buchilo Tsogo, we are sorry for not having recourse to you, but really the time is against us. I know you. I know that you were also a Council of Europe delegate like with us, and you have a lot to say, but the time is against us and we have to wrap up as quick as possible. And the last step here to do is to have the last words of all the panelists we have here. And you have 1 minute, closing word. What is your take? What do you see? What are your reflections? What are your contemplations about all what we have discussed? And I would like this time to start with Mandeepa. Please go ahead. One last word.
One last word. I think one of the issues we didn't get to touch on that I think is really important is the amplification of young people and how they should be counted in society, right? You know, policymakers, civil society, community leaders, government alike, you know, they really need to sit down, and us ourselves as youth as well need to sit down and mobilize around this question that I'm going to put out there for everybody to go away with. What is the currency of access for young people that are in my sphere of influence, right? What does it cost them to access better resources, better training, better socioeconomic improvement, so that they're motivated to engage in active citizenship from a proactive rather than a reactive standpoint, right? We really need to start thinking strategically about Africa's young people as key stakeholders in various political economies of our countries and remove these tokenistic and ageist barriers devoid of inclusion so that we can understand stakeholder management. And, you know, in light of endemic informality in Africa, the normalization of patron-client relations, otherwise known as corruption in the purest sense, young people in Africa still need to fend for themselves, migrate, or, you know, basically do the impossible in survival mode. And we really need to think through that currency of access and what it means for the average young person in Africa if we're going to address these issues.
Thank you very much, Mandeepa. Shannon, shall we have your closing word?
Thanks, Mohammed. I want to address some of the questions around civic engagement. I think accusations of apathy are often leveled at youth when we know that youth are participating in political structures just in non-traditional ways. And we must look at the reasons why there are barriers for that participation, but also youth believe that nothing comes of that participation. And I think that points to a larger need of reflexivity and accountability from our governance structures to meet youth where they are. This idea that we just aren't participating because we aren't participating in the traditional ways is incorrect, and it devalues the role that youth are playing in the political sphere at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Dido, one last word.
Thank you. I think, and Mandeepa referenced this in the beginning, but this crisis that we're in is really an opportunity for us to rethink how we are engaging democracy, how we're engaging governance. And I really like what Shannon had mentioned just about how youth are participating and youth are very engaged, as we can see even with the numbers of questions and the people that are on this panel, on where our democracies and where our governance is headed. often participating, yes, in non-traditional ways, but also at high expense to themselves. Let's not forget just the sheer number of violence, even recently in the NSAS movement, right? So youth are at the risk of their own lives, their own peace, their own protection, really trying to make a difference in governance. And I think the work that needs to be done here is really for us to, yes, rely on government but then move away from, I think, that expectation of a top-down approach. Because I think Louise also mentioned it beautifully. She said the people that are presidents these days were very compelling youth activists. They demanded and took their seats at the table. And I think there's such opportunity for us to mobilize around. And I was really shocked. I only recently found this out myself, just the sheer number of youth-led movements that are going on, not just at an international scale, but even at the local levels. And I would encourage everyone, if you're thinking about how do I get involved, really just do a quick search. I think Restless Development has a really great database. Afrobarometer might have a database of just youth movements and youth organizations, even in your locale, that you can participate in. Because the only way in which we can make sustainable change, history has shown us, is through grassroots movements. We need to build a critical mass to be able to have a voice, to be able to take a seat at these tables and really just build these structures in a way that benefit us in our future. And those would be my last words, really, that of hope that we can make a difference. I think not all is as lost as we think. Not all really lies in government to now pay attention to us. I think we can harness the energy of youthfulness that we already possess to make a real difference.
Thank you, Dido. This was also worth thinking, and building the structure. And of course, in my personal opinion, requires theorization in terms of political theory, in terms of governmental theory, which we are lacking academically for the moment in Africa. Louise, your last word and your closing word. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mohammed. So I have so many things to say. So unfortunately, I find myself incapable of producing a last word because I'm still very hungry to speak about this topic. So my last word then would be, can we please continue the conversation online? So everyone that was in the chat and not able to speak, I have my phone attached to my hand permanently every day. Let's continue the conversation online. The hashtags are hashtag Voices Africa, hashtag Youth Unite, hashtag Youth Empowerment. And Afrobarometer has also been posting us the whole week, and they've been posting throughout the webinar. So it's very easy for you to get into contact or to connect with all of us on the panel and everyone at Afrobarometer as well. So bye, but like not bye at the same time, because we'll catch up online.
Thank you very much, Louise. And this was really nice of you that you invite people to communicate with you through social media. Ladies and gentlemen, what shall we say? Still, the topic that we are discussing for the moment is really branched and branched and associated with the future, with the near and the midterm and the long-term future. From my perspective, I've been listening to you and asking, from my part as language of diplomacy analysts, just a quick question came to my mind, which is, what about the African diplomacy? Can the African diplomacy and the African relations create new horizons for the governmental and democratic facets of governing this continent? Let's make it open book question, just for reflection after this webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank you for attending. We would like also to thank a million our dear panelists for their very enlightening and superbly interesting interventions, filled with knowledge, filled with paramount and important information. And what shall we say? Shall we say the webinar is over, and we can now, Louise can have her dinner now. Yeah. Please, just before we end, shall we have like a group picture? Wait, who is in charge of taking the pictures?
Again, thank you everyone for taking part in this webinar, the pictures taken. Thanks to our brilliant panelists. Certainly, we were enlightened by your insights. And we say au revoir and à bientôt. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Madam Nafisa.
Bye.
Goodbye.